They said it was just a school trip until the bus never came back. For 20 years, the mountains kept their secret buried under snow and silence. What a hiker found sealed in a forgotten tunnel changed everything. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. I still remember how the sky looked that morning in March 2004, like someone had smeared pale blue paint across a wide, clean canvas. We were loud, laughing, tossing our bags into the storage compartment of the bus without a care in the world. 13 of us, including Mr. Callahan, who always wore his hiking boots like they were part of his skin and called every mountain a good story waiting to be read. I sat by the window with my sketch pad tucked into my lap, thinking I'd capture the shape of the cliffs or the way the trees bent under snow. We weren't supposed to go far, just to Pine Rock for the weekend. A quick trip before exams and college acceptances pulled us in different directions. My best friend Eva kept teasing me about bringing trail mix like a grandma, while Tyler sat near the back with his headphones already in. The engine coughed to life, and with that, we rolled out of the school parking lot like a normal group of teenagers on a school-sanctioned adventure. Nobody waved goodbye. Nobody thought they had to. We passed the last gas station an hour in, and the reception bars on my phone dropped to 0 soon after. I didn't mind. The trees got taller, the road narrower, and snow from the last storm still clung stubbornly to the forest floor. The bus heater was cranked up too high, making the windows fog. Mr. Callahan kept turning around in his seat to ask if we were warm enough, cheerful in that over-caffeinated way teachers get on field trips. Someone played cards across the aisle. Someone else complained about needing to pee. It all felt so human, so ordinary. The last clear landmark I remember was a wooden sign half buried in snow with flaked paint that read Pine Rock Wildlife Trail. After that, the road started climbing, then winding, then twisting into switchbacks that made my stomach pull tight with every turn. At some point, I looked up from my sketch pad and realized the sun had dipped behind a curtain of clouds and the trees had become dense enough to press like bodies against the bus windows. That was when the air shifted, when the laughter faded into nervous silence, and even Mr. Callahan stopped humming along to the radio. I couldn't say exactly when I felt it, but I remember thinking something had gone wrong, like the road beneath us didn't want to be found. When we were expected back Sunday evening, parents waited with engines running and headlights on. They waited for a bus that never came, for voices that never carried down the highway. I sometimes wonder if they knew deep in their bones long before the news vans arrived and the posters went up that we weren't coming home, that the road had swallowed us whole, that the trail we were on was never marked for return. The first flakes came like whispers against the windshield, gentle and innocent at first, like the mountain was trying to lull us into staying still. We'd pulled over somewhere past a fork in the trail road, trying to make sense of the faded signs and the sudden silence on the radio. Mr. Callahan stepped out to check the map, muttering to himself, his boots crunching over ice that hadn't been there an hour before. I remember wiping the condensation off my window and watching the snow begin to thicken, like someone shaking a snow globe harder than they meant to. Within an hour, the road behind us was gone, just gone. The tire tracks we'd followed in started disappearing, and the sky went that strange white-gray color that feels like it has no top, no bottom, just endless drift. The bus heater started making a wheezing sound, like it knew this wasn't what it signed up for. Inside, we huddled in our jackets, pulling hats lower, watching as the windshield disappeared behind frost. Eva whispered that she had a bad feeling. Tyler finally took out his headphones. Mr. Callahan came back in with snow clinging to his eyebrows and told us to stay calm. He said he'd try the radio again once we moved to higher ground. That was before we realized the engine wouldn't turn over. No cell service, no working radio. And outside, the snow had thickened to the point you couldn't see 5 feet ahead. We tried to stay cheerful the first night, played cards, told stories, ate our snack food like it was a picnic. But when the windows iced over completely, and the cold started biting even through the layers, no one pretended anymore. Mr. Callahan rationed the fuel by running the bus heat for 10 minutes every couple hours. I took out my sketch pad but didn't draw. I just stared at the blank page and listened to the snow pile up. When morning came, it didn't really arrive. Everything outside was still that eerie blue. Mr. Callahan tried hiking up the ridge alone but came back, after an hour, limping and pale. He didn't say what he saw, only that we couldn't risk splitting up. We used duct tape to seal the windows. Ate peanut butter out of tiny cups. Someone cried under a blanket. Someone else started counting days by carving lines into the plastic seat. But it didn't feel like days. It felt like time had folded in on itself. When the food ran low, we stopped speaking unless necessary. Our breath fogged the air and stuck to the windows like ghosts trying to escape. I remember thinking the mountain wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It just didn't care. We were nothing to it, no different than branches snapped by wind or birds frozen mid-flight. The storm didn't howl. It hushed. And in that hush, we started to disappear. They called us the Missing 13. I remember the first time I saw it printed in bold on a newspaper left behind at a ranger's outpost years later, long after anyone was still supposed to be looking. 12 students and 1 teacher. 13 names, 13 faces, mine included, staring out from flyers that had been stapled to telephone poles and gas station windows, fluttering in the wind like fading prayers. My parents used to say my school photo didn't look like me, that it didn't show how much I squinted when I laughed, or the way I always tilted my head in group shots. But there I was, frozen at 17 in a blue windbreaker, part of a gallery of kids who vanished without a goodbye. Denise's smile was crooked in hers. Marcus looked older than he was. Eva had glitter on her eyelids because she'd come straight from a pep rally that day. And Mr. Callahan stood at the end, caught mid-blink like he hadn't wanted to be in the photo at all. Our parents turned into search parties. They didn't wait for the government, or the school district, or even the park rangers to do something. They drove their own trucks, pitched their own tents, printed maps, shared walkie-talkies, and refused to sleep unless they had combed one more trail, checked one more ravine. I used to dream of what that looked like. My mother with a thermos in her hand, eyes red but stubborn, refusing to believe her daughter had become a statistic. They held candlelight vigils. They lit up stretches of highway with signs and string lights. A few of the dads hired private pilots to scan the ridges from the air. Nothing ever came of it. Nothing but one broken compass found near a ranger station. They said it wasn't enough to prove anything, not enough to point to foul play or survival or death, just something left behind. I used to wonder if it was mine, if it had slipped from my pocket while I was trying to find a signal, or if maybe it had belonged to Tyler, who always had camping gear even when we didn't need it. As time passed, the flyers grew yellow, brittle at the corners, replaced by new tragedies. But some stayed up, stuck behind bulletin boards, or forgotten inside church halls. When I picture my parents now, I don't see them crying. I see them waiting, at the kitchen table, by the door, at every holiday, with an empty plate and a folded napkin just in case. They never buried us because they never had anything to bury. We were a wound that never scabbed, a case that never closed. And for me, still alive, under all that silence, that truth was heavier than the cold ever was. We weren't lost. We were just unheard. Time has a strange way of stretching when you're the one people are whispering about. In the beginning, the story of our disappearance was just that, a story passed around with somber expressions and quiet sympathy. But as the years went on and no bodies surfaced, no footprints reappeared in the snow, no farewell notes were found tucked into tree trunks or crevices, the silence started to itch at the town's collective conscience. People began filling the void with anything they could. At first, it was harmless speculation. Maybe the bus took a wrong turn and slipped off an unmarked road. Maybe we were still alive in some hidden valley, waiting to be found. But then, the stories started warping. I remember hearing someone mention a cult, like we'd all been taken in by some mountain hermit preaching salvation. Others said there were old government bunkers out there, from wars past, and that we had stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. The wildest theory was that we had been abducted by something not quite human, that the mountains held secrets meant to stay buried, and we had awakened them. These ideas weren't whispered in corners anymore. They made their way into podcasts, late-night radio shows, and true crime forums. Strangers I had never met were arguing about whether I had joined a doomsday group or been spirited away by federal agents. I even saw a man on television claim he found our tracks, though the photos he showed were just raccoon prints in the mud. Meanwhile, the parents grieved in their own ways. Some clung to hope like it was a religion. Every March, around the anniversary, I heard there were candlelight vigils. My name and face lit up again, not in birthday cards, but in quiet gatherings where tears were shed in the shadows. Other families shut down completely. They stopped talking about it, boxed away the photos, and wouldn't answer reporters' calls. I don't blame them. Hope can be loud, but silence is sometimes louder. I thought about them often during those years. I wondered if my mom still had that blue scarf she used to wear to every school game. I wondered if she ever stopped keeping my room clean, just in case I came home. There's something cruel about being both gone and alive, about hearing the world twist your story into something that doesn't feel like yours anymore. I wanted to scream sometimes, just to remind them that we weren't myths or metaphors. We were kids, just kids who got on a bus. And while the world filled the silence with shadows and legends, the truth waited. It always waited. It sat in the dark, steady and patient, buried under years of guesses and ghost stories, knowing one day someone would finally listen. I had stopped hoping a long time ago. Hope had teeth. It bit down every time a new lead turned out to be nothing. Every time someone said they'd seen something strange in the mountains, and it ended with a raccoon skull or an old boot that wasn't ours. So when the news came in 2024, it didn't hit me like a lightning bolt. It moved slower, like a cold front creeping into my chest. A hiker, just a man with a camera and a pair of borrowed boots, had strayed into a section of pine rock that had been closed off for years. Snowmelt and landslides had reshaped part of the terrain, exposing rock that hadn't seen light since before I was born. He said he was taking pictures of moss formations when something sharp caught his eye. Not animal. Not stone. Metal. A steel pipe, wedged into the rock like it had been punched through the mountain. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. It was rusted and partially buried, coated in years of ice and moss. But he was a mechanic by trade, he said, and knew the difference between wild debris and something made by hands. He followed it down a slope where the snow had thinned. He said it took him nearly 3 hours to find the tunnel opening, almost hidden under a shelf of rock. It looked like part of a ventilation system, a relic maybe, sealed and forgotten. But there was no record of any structure in that zone. No mines, no military posts, no history. That's when the whispers started again. Some said it was a Cold War bunker. Others thought it might have been a prepper hideout, sealed up tight for the end of the world. But deep down, a few of us already knew. We didn't say it out loud, because saying it meant risking the return of those teeth, the ones that bit down every time it turned out to be just another dead lead. Still, search crews were sent. They brought in archaeologists, engineers, forensic teams. I watched the news like someone staring at a heartbeat monitor. Nothing happened for 2 days, then 3. On the 4th, one of the rescuers called in from the site. He was shaking. Said they'd found something. Not bones. Not belongings. A structure. A space. A sealed tunnel that hadn't seen air in 2 decades. He couldn't describe it. He just said, they were here. And suddenly, I could feel my breath again. After 20 years of silence, the mountain had finally spoken. I watched the footage from my kitchen table, the screen flickering against the steam rising from a cup of tea I'd forgotten to drink. It didn't feel real, even when the date stamp read 2024. The tunnel they found wasn't a natural cave or some old mining site like they first guessed. It was man-made, buried beneath years of rock and snow. The entrance collapsed inward, as if someone had tried to seal it from the inside. The metal was thick, ribbed with rust and age, bolted into the mountainside with industrial strength. It wasn't marked on any surveyor's record or satellite image. No one had a blueprint. No agency claimed it. The only thing that made sense was that someone had gone to great lengths to build it in secret and keep it hidden. I remember gripping the edge of the table when they showed the rescue team stepping into that darkness. Their suits gleamed under the helmet lights, oxygen tanks strapped to their backs, like something out of a different century. They moved slowly, deliberate, clearing the fallen rock with careful hands, brushing away years of silence. One of them paused to point at the wall near the entrance. There were scratches in the metal, faint but deliberate. Letters, numbers, someone had written on the steel. They didn't show us all of it right away, just flashes of words like help and stuck. That was enough. The camera followed them deeper into the tunnel, the walls narrowing, curving slightly downward, swallowing the light behind them. Everything about it felt wrong, too clean, too planned. One rescuer said the walls had insulation and wiring, like it was meant to be lived in. Another found a broken light fixture and what looked like an air duct. I couldn't tear my eyes away. 20 years of wondering, of waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard my brother's voice in the wind, and now, here it was, proof. This place wasn't a myth or a wild story passed between grieving parents. It was real. It was cold and buried and full of answers. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table and watched the looped footage until dawn crept into the room like a ghost. When the screen faded to black between reports, I whispered his name into the silence, just once, just to see if it echoed back from somewhere inside that mountain. When they finally released the interior footage, I sat alone in my car in the grocery store parking lot, watching it through tears that wouldn't stop no matter how tightly I gripped the steering wheel. The camera panned across the narrow corridor of the tunnel, and there they were, school bags, half collapsed and frayed at the seams, the kind you'd find slung over a shoulder on any ordinary Monday morning. One still had a dangling keychain, a little plastic bear worn smooth with age. Another had initials written in black marker, faded but readable. A torn sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, covered in dust, the fabric shredded like someone had tried to pull it apart. But what sent my stomach folding in on itself was the camcorder. Old, its casing cracked near the lens, a relic from the early 2000s, resting on its side like it had simply been dropped. It looked so out of place among the rot and ruin, like something left behind mid-breath. They hadn't played the footage yet, not publicly. Just showed the device, confirmed the date on the internal memory matched the trip. but my mind filled in the rest. I could see them, huddled around it, recording messages in whispers, too scared to speak loud, afraid of what might be listening just beyond the tunnel walls. Then came the spray paint. Red letters streaked across the concrete, jagged and uneven, like the hand that wrote them had been shaking. We tried to go back. That phrase lodged itself in my throat, like a stone. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a scream, a final confession, a marker of last efforts. I imagined them standing there, arguing, scared, deciding whether to wait or leave, hope or run. The writing wasn't near the exit. It was deeper in, like they had already tried and failed. I didn't realize I had started whispering their names again until the screen faded. I hadn't said them aloud in years. Not all of them. It hurt too much. But now those names had weight again. They weren't missing anymore. They had lived in that place. Slept, cried, maybe even laughed for a while before fear settled in. And somewhere, in that darkness, they had tried to go back. I clutched the steering wheel tighter and closed my eyes, not to cry, but to picture the hallway. Not as it was now, but how it must have looked then, when those backpacks still smelled like home and the camcorder still worked, when they still believed there was a way out. I watched the footage 5 times before I let myself believe it was real. The recovered camcorder, cleaned and connected to a digital reader, played through static and warping color until the screen steadied, and suddenly they were there. 12 students and Mr. Callahan gathered around a weak fire that barely lit the tunnel walls. The camera was set on something flat, maybe a stone or a backpack, and tilted just slightly, as if someone had set it down in a hurry. Their faces flickered in and out of clarity, ghost-like, all shadow and blur. But there was no mistaking the fear in their eyes. Mr. Callahan stood near the edge of the frame, talking fast, his voice thin and rasping. "They sealed the exit," he said, pacing like his thoughts were running too quickly to stay still. "We weren't supposed to find this place. I think it was part of something. A site, military maybe, or research. It doesn't matter. What matters is they know we're here." One of the girls started to cry. A boy wrapped his arm around her and looked straight into the camera, lips pressed together like he wanted to scream, but had already used up his voice. Mr. Callahan bent to adjust the fire, his hands trembling. "If this camera makes it out, if anyone sees this, you need to tell them we didn't get lost. We were put here. And whoever did this, they're still watching." There was a sound in the background then, faint but sharp, a metal clank echoing down the tunnel like something being dragged. Everyone froze. The girls stopped crying. Someone whispered, "It's back." Mr. Callahan looked straight at the camera now. His eyes were wide, unblinking. "Tell our families we tried. Tell them we fought." The video glitched then, flickered with horizontal lines, but the audio stayed clear. Heavy breathing, footsteps, someone praying under their breath. Then a sudden shout, and the camcorder must have been grabbed because the image jolted, flipped sideways, caught one last glimpse of the tunnel entrance before cutting to black. I couldn't move for a long time after the video ended. It was like hearing voices from the bottom of a well, voices that had been trapped under dirt and ice for 2 decades, suddenly shouting for air. These weren't rumors anymore. They were real. They were scared. And Mr. Callahan's last words clung to me like frost. "We were put here." I whispered it to myself like a vow. Because if the world had forgotten them, if time had buried them under false stories and broken search maps, then this tape was their proof, their testimony, their refusal to disappear without a trace. When the first set of documents surfaced, I didn't want to believe them. They weren't classified anymore, just buried deep enough in old archives that only someone really looking would ever stumble upon them. They'd been part of a Cold War-era project known as Shelter Echo, and the name alone made my stomach turn. The papers were yellowed scans, full of blacked-out lines and bureaucratic language that made it sound mundane, like it was just another line item in a dusty defense budget. But the truth buried in those paragraphs was anything but ordinary. The tunnel we found had never been listed on any civilian maps because it was never meant to be found. It had been constructed as a temporary living space for personnel during simulated lockdown scenarios. No civilians were supposed to be near it, no students, no weekend school trips. There was a map, sketched in blue ink, showing 2 sealed doors and a ventilation shaft that had long since collapsed. No access, no exits, like a test cage with no plan for rescue. I sat with those papers, feeling the weight of every name on the missing list. It wasn't an accident anymore. It wasn't a bus detour gone wrong. It was a trap that had been laid decades ago and never dismantled. Someone knew it was still out there. Someone knew what it could become, if it was ever found. The documents mentioned psychological endurance metrics, exposure tests, isolation response timelines. Words that didn't belong next to the names of teenagers with backpacks and snack bags and prom dates waiting back home. Mr. Callahan hadn't been lying when he said they weren't supposed to find it. He had walked them into a ghost from another war, and the door shut behind them before anyone could realize it was never supposed to open. I started seeing everything differently after that. The silence from officials. The classified zones marked for wildlife preservation. The sudden withdrawal of state funding for the investigation back in 2005. It wasn't just bureaucratic neglect. It was cleanup. Quiet, invisible, and complete. Except they forgot one thing. They forgot what grief does to people. What it did to parents like mine, who never stopped searching. What it did to hikers who still wandered beyond marked trails, trying to find the edge of a story that never fit the ending they were handed. We weren't supposed to know, but now we did. And once you see something like that, proof that your friends weren't just lost, but swallowed by a lie built into the bones of the earth, you can't go back. You can't let it stay quiet. Shelter Echo wasn't just a name. It was a sentence. And it echoed through every empty chair at graduation, every untouched locker, every night a mother left the porch light on, just in case someone came walking up the path. I held the notebook like it might fall apart if I turned the pages too fast. Its corners softened from handling, the spine cracked and bowed, the cover marked with water stains, and something darker. It was Mr. Callahan's handwriting, slanted and urgent, looping across each line like a man running out of time. He had started it on the second night after they realized the tunnel was not just a passage but a trap. His words read like someone trying to stay calm for the sake of others, but every few pages the mask slipped. He wrote that they had found the tunnel while taking a trail detour after the storm damaged the main route. They thought it was a ranger shelter or maybe an old mining station, and when one of the boys spotted a door propped open and bolted with iron rods, curiosity won. It always does. He mentioned how the students had joked at first, calling it the bunker and setting up sleeping bags near the entrance. But then the door they came through wouldn't budge. He tried to radio for help, but got only static. Day 3, he noted they were already rationing granola bars and trail mix, and the temperature inside stayed just above freezing. One girl had a panic attack, and another boy got sick from drinking water pooled near the wall. Page after page, his optimism thinned like smoke in wind. By day 6, the journal turned darker. They heard noises deeper in the tunnel metal shifting, something scraping. He wrote that he no longer believed this place was abandoned. He had tried to find another exit, but said every corridor he explored ended in welded steel or collapsed brick. He blamed himself repeatedly for leading them into it, circling his guilt in messy loops. I brought them here. I told them it was safe. He kept a log of what they ate and when. He tracked their moods like a doctor. noting who cried, who snapped, who went quiet. The last few entries were shorter, as if he no longer had the strength or hope to explain. The final page simply said, "They trusted me." I sat there in the cold, holding that sentence like a stone in my chest. Somehow, reading his words made it worse, because it meant he never gave up trying to get them out. It meant they waited and believed in him, even when the lights failed and the silence closed in. It meant they were still human in there, still hoping someone would find them, and for 20 years, no one did. I remember standing inside that tunnel with my flashlight, catching on those jagged scrapings along the concrete wall, each mark a scream carved in silence. You could see where they had used everything they had: keys, belt buckles, pens snapped in half and sharpened to points to etch a way out. Some of the names were carved over and over again, as if repeating them was the only way to stay real. My breath caught when I saw "Tyler was here," scratched low and deep beside a hatch door sealed with thick bolts and rusted hinges. The journal had mentioned a final attempt, and this had to be it. Tyler, one of the students, had convinced the others that he heard something above boots crunching gravel, or maybe voices distorted by snow. Callahan had hesitated at first, the journal said, afraid of wasting energy or giving the group false hope, but Tyler wouldn't let it go. They spent hours, maybe days, trying to open that hatch. The markings showed frustration and exhaustion, slashes that veered off or cracked the wall's outer shell. Someone had tried to wedge a steel water bottle into the seam and hammer it upward. Someone else wrote in red marker just above the latch, "We know you're there. Please help." The air was colder there, still thick with grief. It wasn't just an escape attempt, it was a final stand. They had left behind wrappers, hairbands, a cracked walkie-talkie, little offerings to hope, like breadcrumbs through darkness. One message was barely legible, written in pencil, smudged by moisture. "If anyone finds this, tell my mom I wore the necklace." That undid me more than anything. These were kids. They were freezing, starving, terrified, and still thinking about their mothers. I thought about Tyler then. I pictured him pressing his ear to the ceiling of that tomb, swearing he heard footsteps, his voice trembling but certain. I imagined Callahan finally giving in, rallying them with whatever strength he had left, handing out whatever tools they could find to chip at the metal and whisper encouragement. And I imagined the moment they realized it wasn't going to open, that the noise Tyler heard was probably just the wind, that no one was coming. I turned off my flashlight for a second and let the dark sit with me. It was heavy, but not silent, like the space remembered them, like it still echoed with scraped metal and whispers of names. That hatch held back more than cold. It held the end of their trying. They said 12, but I only saw fragments of names when they pulled the bodies from the frostbitten floor, the blankets stuck to their bones like stories half-whispered and long buried. I stood at the edge of the search perimeter, the wind knifing through my coat, and for a second I could swear I heard voices. Not crying out, not screaming, but that kind of soft talking you hear between friends when they know no one is listening, the kind that means someone tried to comfort someone else right before the end. The rescue team moved like ghosts around the scene, careful, reverent, like they had stepped into a place too holy for noise. Each emergency blanket was a tomb in cloth, corners frayed from desperate hands that must have wrapped them around each other in the final hours. I watched them uncover what they said was the 13th body, separated from the others, slumped near the blocked exit, a figure in a faded parka with the zipper rusted halfway down. His arms were curled around something like he had been guarding it, even in death. They found the journal first, sealed in a Ziploc bag pressed against his chest, then the tool he had carved from a broken hiking pole, whittled down and filed to a point like he had tried to dig or pry or chip his way out. Someone whispered the name Mr. Callahan, and it took all the air out of my lungs. I remembered the man from the photos, the kind of teacher who wore too many pens in his shirt pocket and smiled like he knew his students better than their parents did. To see him now like that, collapsed in the shadows of a dead-end tunnel, made me feel like we had failed him somehow, like we had let the silence win for too long. The blankets didn't match. Some were silver and others blue. Someone had tried to color-code something, maybe warmth levels, maybe injuries. There were numbers scrawled in the dust on the nearby wall, as if keeping track of time or people or dwindling supplies. The rescue team didn't speak much. I didn't either. I stood there while they zipped the bags, while they lifted what was left of those kids, and I kept thinking about how long it takes for hope to freeze. Not just the body, but belief itself. 20 years is a long time to wait for an answer, but the cold doesn't care about years. It just preserves what it wants. I don't know what made me look past the recovery zone. Maybe instinct, or maybe just the refusal to accept that this was the whole story, but something kept tugging at my thoughts, like a loose thread in the back of my mind. While the others were cataloging bones and tagging bags, I wandered further up the slope, eyes scanning for something, anything, that didn't fit the picture we had been handed. That's when I saw it, half buried in a pocket of snow and wedged tight between two boulders, a tiny worn sneaker, frayed at the toe and barely holding its shape. It wasn't part of the equipment list, and it hadn't been logged with the rest of the items recovered from the shelter. My stomach dropped the moment I touched it because I knew this didn't belong to the bodies we had just counted. It was smaller, lighter, too clean in a way that made my breath catch. I called it in, and the others followed the trail like a prayer, slowly, carefully, watching where the prints started to stagger, rising toward the cliffs like whoever wore that shoe was climbing toward something they couldn't name. The footprints were shallow at first, then deep, then scattered like the person had stumbled or crawled or gotten back up when they had no right to. There weren't many of them, just enough to suggest movement and desperation and the thinnest thread of impossible survival. Every inch of snow we brushed aside felt like peeling back time. No one said it out loud, but we all thought the same thing. One of them had gotten out. Not far, not easily, not fast, but far enough to die under open sky instead of behind a rusted hatch. It's strange how something as small as a sneaker can rewrite the whole weight of 20 years. How it can plant new questions inside old wounds. Who was it? How far did they make it? Did they fall? Did they freeze before anyone saw them? I kept picturing a child, maybe no older than 16, face wind-burned, hands raw, clinging to rocks while the rest waited below. Maybe they volunteered. Maybe they promised to come back with help, and maybe they died believing they would. The trail ended just before the ridge, the prints too faint, the wind too cruel. We never found a body up there, just that one shoe and the silence it left behind. But I remember thinking how even a single footprint can echo louder than all the years of nothing. How a piece of rubber and canvas can carry the shape of someone's last hope long after their voice is gone. I wasn't supposed to find it, at least not that late in the excavation. We'd already marked out the major evidence, bagged every artifact, documented every scrape on the tunnel wall, and every torn page from Callahan's journal. The site was winding down. The last crew packing equipment, the cameras shut off, the ground settling again like it wanted to forget. But I stayed behind just a few more minutes, retracing a corner near the fire pit, where the shadows hung heavier and the soot on the walls seemed fresher than it should have been. That's where I noticed a stone slightly ajar, out of line with the others. My fingers slipped behind it and caught something cold and plastic, tucked so precisely it must have taken careful hands and shaking breaths to hide. It was a tape, An old mini cassette, the kind that fit in a handheld recorder, its label torn but with faint writing still clinging to the edges. We scrambled to get a device that would still play it, dust flying as we brought the past back into motion. The static hit first, long and cracked like someone pressing their whole life through a whisper. Then her voice. "If someone finds this," she said, and the words stopped all of us, even the veterans who'd seen too much already. "Tell them we weren't lost, we were left." Her name was Annalise Monroe, 17, cheer captain, honor roll. Not someone the town remembered as loud or defiant, but on that tape, her voice was steel beneath the tremble. She spoke of how they found the tunnel by accident, how they tried to leave but realized too late it wasn't built for exits. She described rationing crackers, melted snow, fever dreams that came with hunger, the arguments that turned into whispers and then into silence. She said Callahan tried to protect them, but his hands shook when he thought they weren't looking. She said they drew straws to see who would try to climb out. Tyler went first, then Jonah. Neither came back. She never said who she was when she recorded the message, only that her name should matter. And it did. That voice, that sliver of raw memory, cut through 2 decades of press conferences and speculation. It made the official reports feel like cardboard. Because this wasn't just a tragedy. It was betrayal. That tape wasn't meant for the news or the police. It was meant for someone who still thought there was a chance to make things right. When the last word played and the tape clicked off, I sat in that cold, damp air and felt the shape of what they had endured press against my chest. She wasn't asking for pity. She was demanding the truth. And somehow, through that single voice, sealed in stone, she got it. I stood there as the last chisel was lifted from the stone, fingers still dusted with granite, eyes stinging from the cold and something heavier. The tunnel mouth was behind me, sealed now, not with concrete or excuses, but with a wall of names carved deeper than the hurt they carried. 13 of them, 12 students and 1 teacher. 13 lights were installed, one above each name, wired to flicker on at dusk and burn through the night, like they were refusing to be forgotten again. I kept running my hand over Annalise's name, not to clean it or trace the letters, but to feel something real, something unshakable after weeks of footage, bones, theories, and ghosts. Her words were etched beneath, not in quotes, not dressed up with ceremony, just the truth as she left it. We weren't lost. We were left. I watched the families arrive, some limping with age, others still dragging hope behind them like a shadow. They brought folded papers and faded photos, stuffed animals that had waited 20 years in closets, and candles that wouldn't stay lit in the wind. No one gave speeches. There wasn't a podium. Just people standing quietly around a wound finally given shape. I remember a man who had been a brother to one of the boys, now middle-aged, placing a football helmet at the base of the plaque. It was dented, scraped from years of use, but it had been his brother's favorite. He didn't say anything, just nodded once like he was handing it over to time. A girl, no older than Annalise had been, stood beside the memorial and sang something soft. Maybe a hymn, maybe just the only words she knew to make the silence less sharp. I kept thinking how strange it was that the mountain had held them all this time, like a secret, and now it stood there watching as we tried to make peace with what we found. When night fell, the lights came on one by one, not blinking or stuttering but steady, like they knew what they meant. I didn't want to leave. Not right away. I stayed long enough to see the moon rise above the ridge, casting shadows across the names and pulling a thin mist from the trees. Someone left a journal beside the marker, open to a page with no writing, just a drawing of a tunnel and stars above it. I thought of Annalise and the others, how they held each other in the dark, how they carved hope into the rock with fingernails and firelight. And I thought about how sometimes telling the story right is the only justice left. So I whispered her words again, not into the mountain, but into the air where they could finally travel. We weren't lost. We were left, but not anymore. Now they were seen, and now they were home.